They told me family dinners were sacred. That night, silence became my first scar. The mahogany table gleamed beneath the chandelier light marching across crystal and silver. Ancestors stared from gilt frames in dress blues, a jury that never recessed. I sat 2 places down from my father, close enough to hear his breath, far enough to be dismissed. To Maddie, he said, glass lifted. The next true officer of this family. Crystal chimed. The room obeyed. Lieutenant Madeline Ramirez accepted the praise like a medal already pinned. She didn't look at me. She looked through me. Dan Carter shifted beside me, a consultant who knew when not to speak. I angled my plate, watching the chandelier fracture me into smaller pieces. I had news, a briefing approved, a near catastrophe avoided, because I caught a vowel bent the wrong way. None of that mattered under these portraits. Here, valor required noise. So Grace Maddie said lightly, wine circling still a ghost in the system. Laughter slid down the tablecloth. My father's eyes grazed me, no anger, only appraisal, as if testing a sight. Mom's voice threaded the air, a soft memory. Justice doesn't shout, it stands. I kept the sentence on my tongue like a coin I couldn't spend. I presented last week, I said carefully. The Sahel packet. We're celebrating tonight, my father cut in. Let the operators have the floor. Another ripple of laughter. I counted fork ridges to steady my face. Servers moved with parade precision. The room smelled of time and old decisions. I rehearsed replies and buried each one in napkin folds. Maddie leaned elbow off china. Don't take it personally. Some of us deploy. I almost told her about a route that changed because I read a proverb about a convoy that lived, because I heard fear under bravado. Almost. I let the almost die. Deliverables, someone said. The board wants them by Friday. Dan will handle it. My father answered. He translates numbers into action. Dan's jaw tightened. He didn't look toward me. Dessert arrived. My father rose, glass-high voice measured. He spoke of honor the way other men talk about weather. He named Maddie again. He did not say my name. The portrait seemed to lean closer. I felt the judgment of men who never had to explain themselves to a daughter. Grace. My father said the syllable clean as a crack in ice. The room quieted. You are a disappointment to the Cole name. No one gasped. You don't gasp at a foregone conclusion. You file it smooth, the page, move on. Heat reached my face and retreated. Dan shifted. Maddie studied me like a specimen. I folded my napkin once, then again, until it became a small white blade in my lap. I wanted to ask what disappoints a name that never asks what I saved. I wanted to say ghosts aren't absent. They're why houses keep standing. I wanted to make the portraits blink. Instead, I stood carefully, careful as a fuse. I touched the back of my chair and let the room arrange itself around my silence. The china cooled. My father resumed his toast with a practiced smile. To officers who carry their weight. Chairs scraped. Crystal kissed crystal. I held my breath until the applause ended and the night exhaled. I swallowed the silence that night, but it would not stay buried. Every portrait on the wall saluted him. None saw me. The Pentagon's walls were blank white, ordered, unyielding, yet I still felt the weight of painted eyes following me. They weren't here, but the memory of them clung like an odor. Every ancestor had bowed to my father's authority. Even in their gilded frames, they had never seen me. Now, in a room where decisions sculpted wars, the air bent the same way. His presence eclipsed mine, and the silence of painted men followed. The briefing room was all glass, metal, and projection screens, but the table carried the same shape as home, my father at the head, others orbiting his gravity. I arranged my slides, voice steady, the product of weeks of data pulled thread by thread. Satellite imagery indicates irregular movements along the border. Dan Richards' voice cut across mine, smooth as command given on parade. This is your area. Translate for us. His eyes never moved toward me. His finger flicked the air like he was dismissing a fly. Dan leaned forward, his tone practiced neutrality. Essentially, our systems flagged unusual convoy patterns, risk factor elevated. His words were my findings in thinner clothing. The board nodded. The general on my left scribbled. My father smiled. I swallowed and tried again. Sir, the methodology is critical without it. The risk assessment, we're interested in results. Not poetry, Richard said. A chuckle threaded the room. My words shrank, folded into the white noise of pens scratching. My lungs stung with air I couldn't spend. Dan didn't look at me. He avoided my eyes with the precision of someone who knew what it cost to glance. Detached, almost clinical, as if silence was his armor. It might have been self-preservation, or betrayal. The line blurred in the sterile light. Then came Maddie. She entered in uniform sharp lines catching fluorescent beams, the applause of boots on tile. She was supposed to be in training, yet here she was, summoned by my father like an heir to a throne. Colonel Ramirez reporting, she said, chin-up eyes gleaming with the same pride he mirrored back. Their exchange was a closed loop, a bond sealed in brass and ceremony. My report shifted from essential to redundant in the time it took her to salute. I'll take point on forward analysis, she declared. My father nodded once permission granted. Grace, you'll stand down. Optics are delicate. Optics, a word soft enough to disguise its teeth. Optics meant my silence was safer than my presence. Optics meant nepotism cloaked as patriotism. Optics meant my father's shadow could stretch even over federal walls. Around the table, no one flinched. They had learned, as I had, that his word drew the border between existence and erasure. The climax came with a single sentence, precise as a blade. Effective immediately, Grace Cole is cut from the next project. For national security optics. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. His voice carried the portraits here, and they saluted again, blind and loyal. My folders weighed too much. I closed them carefully, afraid the sound of paper might betray me. Dan shifted his pen but said nothing. Maddie sat straighter, basking in approval. I walked out of the room with my silence pressed like glass against my ribs. Losing the project should have ended me. Instead, it gave me reason to begin. Power doesn't need to shout. It simply deletes your name. July pressed heat against the Pentagon's glass until corridors felt airless. On the roster outside the ops unit, my designation vanished between morning and lunch. A blank line yawned where I had stood. I filed the appeal anyway. Citations aligned, methods laid out, signatures exact, then watched the ticket drop from received to closed with the indifference of an elevator. At the liaison desk, a civilian offered a careful smile bureaucracies teach. At this level, she said softly, reversals are unusual. Best stay in your lane. My lane, a painted stripe around a life. I thanked her because that is the ritual, and carried my folder back like a flag furled. I forced a slot onto the advisory calendar, 10 minutes between budget and coffee. 5 became 3. 3 evaporated to none. The invite disappeared mid-draft as if the building exhaled and erased me. No red line, no stamp, only an absence you have to name to feel. I found Dan in analytics bullpen monitor glow, making his face look rinsed. They killed it, I said. On paper I was never assigned. He capped his pen as if diffusing something. Not unexpected. You could say I built the model. Right now, words are mine, he answered. Step wrong, lose a foot. They already took the ground. He glanced up that ceiling check we all learn. Not here. The city slid into evening. A rooftop 3 blocks away hummed with string lights and cohesion toasts. Maddie met me by the railing, the Potomac black behind her like a sealed file. Heard your appeal dissolved? She said, bright as chrome. Tough break. Enjoy the climb. Oh, I intend to. She lifted her glass. Dead-end reports are heavy. Maybe lighter suits you. Polite cruelty is still cruelty. I didn't flinch. Those dead ends will be on your desk next quarter. Learn to read them before they read you. If they arrive, she said and smiled for the crowd. By the service stairwell, Dan waited remote from laughter. She called my work useless, I said. Noise, he murmured. Witnesses remember power, not protests. Then I need witnesses. Careful. He folded a napkin into something like surrender and left me with the fan's steady drone. Morning brought the review room. I heard my name inside and walked in anyway. Richard stood at the head metals catching fluorescence. Colonel I began. Even my appeal contains new data. If the board. He laughed. Not loud, wide. A sound designed to seat everyone. Grace is emotional, he said, pausing for the hook like her mother. The room adjusted around the verdict. Evelyn, whose hand steadied broken days, became a caution sign hung on my neck. Heat rose, then fell. I set my notes down so they would not shake. The data stands whether I speak or swallow it, I said. We'll review what Dan provides. He dismissed me with a magnanimous flick, the gesture of a man who mistakes mercy for mastery. Outside, the corridor stretched white and polished. I pressed a thumb into my palm until pain drew a border I could claim. Downstairs, headlines rolled across a lobby screen. Contracts awarded, commanders' quoted names rung like medals. Between the crawl and the crowd, I measured the space where mine should have been and kept walking. That night, I stood on my roof and let the city spark around me. Sirens braided with distant laughter. A plane stitched itself across the dark like a silver thread. Words had no currency here, but records do, ledgers do, memory does. Deletion is not destruction. It is an invitation to return, stamped louder. I thought silence was weakness. That night I swore it would be my blade. Every corridor in the Pentagon echoed with their boots, not mine. August pressed heat against the marble halls, though the air was kept too cold, the kind of chill that gnawed the bones while brass badges gleamed undisturbed. I walked those corridors and heard cadence that wasn't mine, heels striking in practiced rhythm, voices clipped in command. Richard's presence echoed without him needing to be visible. His rank was in the way aides stiffened when he passed, in the hush that fell when his name was mentioned. My vow from July pulsed like a scar. Silence would be my blade. But blades need sharpening, and all I held were empty hands. In the briefing chamber, screens glowed pale blue. My report had been scrubbed from the schedule. Instead, Maddie stood near Richard's shoulder, her insignia newly polished. Her smile was sharp, designed to cut from across the room. I waited for my turn at the podium that never came. Dan sat 2 rows back, eyes lowered to his tablet thumbs, motionless on the screen. I looked to him once, and though his glance flicked up, he said nothing. Silence again, this one not mine, but his. When Richard called for updates, my files should have been displayed. Instead, graphs with altered figures appeared, adjustments that erased the discrepancies I had been mapping for weeks. Procurement costs flattened delivery times, smoothed errors turned to efficiencies. My chest tightened. Someone had not only deleted my work, but rewritten it. Sir, I began, voice level, those figures. Richard's gaze pinned me. Officer Cole? He interrupted, tone rich with command. You are not cleared for this segment. The room went still. Even the projector seemed to hum more softly. Maddie leaned toward him, lips curved. I knew what she was thinking, erased again. I sat back, jaw-locked, pen biting into paper until the tip broke. Afterwards, in the hallway lined with portraits of commanders past, he cornered me. The corridor was empty, but the echo of boots remained. He stepped close enough that his breath carried the bitterness of coffee. One more step, Grace, he said, his voice low, and you vanish. Not from rosters, from everything. Careers end quietly. Understand? I met his eyes. Silence again, but not surrender. His smirk told me he thought he had won. I slipped away into the classified wing, the fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped insects. I told myself I only needed a moment alone, but instinct tugged me deeper. Past a half-open door, I found an archive room, dimly lit shelves of gray boxes lined like soldiers at attention. Something had been left on the wrong desk, a memo half crumpled with dates, misaligned signatures, blurred by a copier. My name wasn't on it, but the error was glaring, too sloppy, too careless for Richard's precision. A ghost of oversight or arrogance disguised as perfection. I shut the door and slid the bolt. The hum of the hall dimmed. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, tracing each line as if touching a pulse. Procurement codes didn't match. Shipping manifests cut corners. Someone had moved money where it shouldn't be and buried it under new numbers. Maddie's promotion, Dan's silence, Richard's threat. They all stitched to this piece of paper left behind as if the building itself wanted me to find it. In that cramped room with dust thick as secrecy and the overhead bulb flickering, I pressed the memo against my chest like contraband. For the first time, I felt the building tremble, not from his boots, but from the fragility of the walls he built. In my hands lay a mistake too sloppy for a man who thought himself untouchable. They said silence buries the truth. I found it in the ashes. September hung like dust in my apartment. I spread the misfiled memo across the kitchen table and anchored its corners with a salt shaker and the brass paperweight from my mother's desk. The page smelled of toner, figures smudged where a copier had bullied them into line. If silence is burial numbers, are shovels. I rebuilt the ledger by hand. Procurement codes became streets, account names safe houses, signatures passports. A pattern surfaced, the funds hopscotched to a vendor that didn't exist last quarter, then returned as expedited logistics. Dates were two clean approvals stamped at hours when offices sleep. I circled a serial that reappeared where it had no right to be. Evelyn's diary waited on the middle shelf tucked inside an old atlas. The elastic had snapped, the spine side open. Her handwriting was spare, almost military. Justice doesn't shout, it stands. Stand with it even when it doesn't stand with you yet. I read it aloud and felt my pulse even out. Between appointments and grocery lists, she copied steadying lines, a field manual for hard days. Back to the memo. The author block had been cropped, but the footer forgot to lie. A print QID sat like a shoeprint under a rug tied to a device in logistics. Temporary admin credentials, M. Ramirez. Maddie. Not a mastermind's flourish, a hurried cover. She had stretched into a system she barely understood and tried to smooth the numbers flat. I sketched a map on butcher paper taped to the wall. Shell vendors. A contracting window widened 3 days without countersignature. A shipment that moved on paper while mechanics waited on parts. Every arrow arced toward the advisory board Richard chaired. The memo wasn't the fraud. It was the bandage, fast, crooked, bleeding through. I carried the diary to Arlington because I needed a place that tells the truth without speaking. The stone was cool. Rows of marble rose from the grass like vertebrae. Wind worked the trees. I sat beside her name and read quietly. Stand with it. I will, I told her. In the quiet, you taught me. On the way back, I texted Dan one line, need a timestamp audit from the 4th floor queue. The bubbles appeared, vanished then. Meet me late. Leave nothing identifiable. Not loyalty, but not refusal. Night thinned the city to a hush. I pinned pages in a grid, wrote states, cross-references until the wall held a constellation of leaks. When I stepped back, the pattern pointed like a compass. I did not have everything. I had enough to begin. I tested the thought that the sloppiness was Richard's. It failed. He doesn't leave fingerprints unless he wants them seen. Maddie does. Her promotion came fast. Her access widened. The memo's margins carried a rookie's panic columns, overwritten totals nudged the footer forgotten. She had covered for him, and by covering, she peeled back a corner of paint. I pressed my palm to the paperweight. Silence will be my blade, I had sworn. Blades require aim. I opened the diary to a page where she had recopied a psalm in her businesslike hand, Teach my hands to war and my fingers to fight. In the margin she had written, "Your war will be with numbers and names. Fight clean." I locked my phone, drew the blinds, and rehearsed the next steps under my breath until they sounded like orders. Tomorrow would test the map. Then I slid the memo into a sleeve and labeled a folder in tidy letters Richard would recognize. External review preliminary. I set it where certain eyes would wander in the morning. The kettle clicked off. Steam lifted and vanished. Discovery hummed. I needed accuracy, patience, and the kind of courage that remembers receipts. Her slip would become my opening shot. They thought I was buried in silence. Instead, I learned to move inside it. October bled into the corridors like thin smoke. In the basement where the air tasted of dust and toner, I learned the rhythm of the archive lights: a blink, a cough, a steady hum that covered footfalls if you kept to the seams of the floor. My badge still opened the first door. A forgotten permission opened the next. I moved with my breath clipped short, counting seconds between camera sweeps, feeling the building breathe around me. Boxes were labeled in a handwriting that pretended to be machine clean. I knew the fiction. The contracts I needed lived in gray binders, vendor ladders, change orders, micro purchases with harmless names. I slid one binder free and found the familiar fingerprints of error columns, massaged totals, smoothed signatures, cropped. Maddie had left a trail and tried to mop it, but haste leaves water behind. I photographed pages in batches and copied the raw files onto a small worn USB I carried under my blouse, attached to a chain that once held my mother's ring. When a vent coughed, I stopped breathing with it. When the light faltered, I stepped into its stutter. Back home, the kitchen table became a field desk. I mapped accounts into constellations, traced payments that sprinted from dormant shells to a vendor with crisp stationery and no footprint. Every hop landed closer to Richard's board, never direct, always angled like light through water. Dates were approved at hours that felt surgical: 02, 1:30, 03, 47, 04, 02. Oversight sleeps then. Predators don't. Dan texted, "Need to talk." No names. I met him behind the cafeteria loading dock where the smell of coffee drowned microphones. He kept his hands in his pockets, eyes on the trucks. "Whatever you think you're building," he said, "make sure it holds when someone kicks it. Are you here to help? Or be a weather report?" He gave half a smile like a man stepping onto thin ice to see if it sings. Patterns travel faster than claims. Get the pattern right. And don't bleed on the paper. "You saw the edits," I said. The numbers were softened. "I saw nothing," he said carefully. And that's the problem. When the story is too smooth, it stops being true. He pressed his shoulder to the wall and let the silence say what he wouldn't. Back at the apartment, I read the files like scripture, singling out verses that didn't belong. A payment note carried a phrase Richard favored: mission velocity, a tell he used in speeches to make theft sound urgent. I wrote it on a card and pinned it beside his initials. The ledger assembled itself. At midnight, I returned to the basement for one more pull. My hands remembered the path. My pulse learned the exits. Near the copy station, a printer throbbed awake. Paper climbed into the tray, a fresh run of the binder I had stripped. Someone else was in the room, or had been moments ago. Footsteps skimmed the hallway. Security sweep. I slid between two rows of shelving and made myself thin. A flashlight combed the door and wandered away. Then the copy station jammed with a wet crumple and the guard swore. When he kicked the bin, I slipped past the red exit sign and let the stairwell swallow me. On the landing, I realized my pocket was light. The USB was gone. Panic burned quick, bright, worthless. I retraced 2 flights in a crouch and saw it glinting near the copier, small and ordinary as a seed. I palmed it, stood up slow, and kept moving. Outside, the night smelled like rain fattening on concrete. I walked until my heart came back to me. The drive warmed in my fist like a living thing. I didn't need all of it tonight. I needed enough to make silence carry weight when I laid it on a table. In the dark, I held proof that silence could scream. Sometimes the smallest flame is what sets the empire on fire. November turned the Pentagon auditorium into a polished stage, flags at attention, a screen humming briefings. I sat 5 rows back, with a lanyard that still opened doors but rarely opened answers. The USB from October pressed a small bruise under my collarbone. Richard owned the room without standing. Maddie held herself like a headline in waiting. The agenda promised transparency on budget allocations, which told me how the next hour would go. Slides sprinted arrows up, costs down, captions tidy. When Q&A opened for concise operational inquiries, I stood. On expedited logistics, I said, how are we reconciling cost spikes, authorized at 02, 13, 03, 47, and 0402 each, under temporary credentials? The room recalibrated. Richard's gaze sharpened like glass near flame. The moderator smiled, a careful smile. We can address specifics offline. I prefer daylight, I said. Unusual hours imply unusual pressure. Who applied it? Maddie took the mic to shield her. Standard surge authorizations, she said. Contingency windows demand decisiveness. Then name the contingency, I said. And who decided? Her tongue tapped the back of her teeth, stalling. Multiple stakeholders, she managed. All within policy. Pens clicked. I delivered the next line flat. Those approvals traced to logistics QK4, temporary admin user M. Ramirez. Her smile glitched, then returned. I rotate across systems, she said. It's documented. Documentation is the question, I said. So is motive. Richard lifted a hand. The moderator moved. Thank you, Captain Cole. Next. Before we move on, I said, for the record, were those authorizations paired with vendor validations, or did verification migrate off system? The audit trail shows a gap. Someone near the aisle coughed a laugh he couldn't catch. A senior official half-turned, measuring me with the curiosity reserved for problems that might be solutions in disguise. Maddie shuffled a packet she should have known by heart, her fingers stuck on a page she hadn't planned to need. Richard stood. He didn't take the mic. Power traveled with him. We don't litigate operational tempo in public, he said softly. Softness worked on most rooms. It bounced off me. When tempo overwrites verification, the cost isn't numbers, I said. It's lives downstream. Silence stretched like wire. In that thinness, a 2-star in row 3 muttered with the weary clarity of a man who'd signed too many condolence letters. If these numbers don't add up, heads will roll. The line landed like a gavel. The moderator blinked, script slipping. Richard's shoulders squared a millimeter. I watched calculation travel across his face. Who told her? How far will she go? Where's the leak? I lowered my eyes to a notebook I'd brought as decoy. The pen traced harmless loops while the real notes waited in string and pins at home. I didn't need to win today. I needed the first curl of smoke seen by men trained to find it. Questions fanned out, safely generic. The auditorium performed relief. I sat and counted breaths in 4 until the lights felt like weather, not interrogation. Maddie kept her camera face, but her heel tapped under the chair. Small tells get loud once you learn the tune. As people filed out, a logistics chief paused and slipped a card into my palm without looking down. For the record, he said to no one, contingencies prefer daylight. I tucked the card against the USB paper to metal, a layered promise. At the aisle's mouth, Richard turned and gave me the look that at home had been verdict. It wasn't tonight. It was assessment, a new category being carved around my outline. The ghost had mass now and friction. For the first time, he looked at me not as a ghost, but as a danger. Silence doesn't mean weakness. It means waiting for the right echo. December laid a pale sheet across the advisory boardroom, winter light, flattening faces turning brass into cold stars. Inside the table was a cage with microphones for bars. Richard sat at the head, his shoulders squared to the day. I took a seat where the light couldn't interrogate me directly, and placed my notes flat and steadied my breath once. He opened with procedure, the lullaby of rank. Slides rolled, efficiencies here, compliance there. Maddie, promoted, sat close enough to catch the halo of his approval. Dan was 3 chairs down, the neutral witness present as a heartbeat. When the floor opened, I stood before anyone could close it. 2 discrepancies, I said, keeping the words steady. Expedited authorizations at off hours and vendor validations migrating off system. The paper trail detours precisely where oversight should strengthen. Richard didn't look at the screen. He looked at me. "We don't debate tempo in this forum, Captain Cole." "This isn't tempo," I replied. "It's geometry." Every line bends around the same chair. A smile practiced for cameras. "You're suggesting intent." "I'm reading what's on the page." Maddie leaned back. "Promotion has clarified things," she said sweetly. "Sometimes the junior view mistakes urgency for wrongdoing." I met her eyes. Sometimes the junior view forgets which doors it opened while pretending to dust the doorknobs. The room shifted, paper rustle, a cough, a pen cap skittering. Richard pressed his palms to the wood. "Disloyalty wears many faces," he said. "Some look like zeal. Some look like envy. Numbers don't look like anything," I said. "They add or they don't." He cut a hand through the air. "Sit down." I stayed standing. QK4 approvals at 02, W13 0347 and 0402. Temporary admin logged from logistics. The validations are missing. Either we misfiled during a surge or someone manufactured a surge to misfile. Maddie's laugh rang, a half-tone too bright. "Captain, your fixation on anomalies is beginning to distract from mission." "The mission requires proof," I said. "So either show it or explain why it vanished." Dan's thumb tapped a rhythm on the folder in front of him. He didn't look up, but his other hand nudged a single page toward the center, accidental plausible, containing a date that matched my list. It was the smallest of alibis, not for me, but for the truth. Richard saw. The temperature dropped. "You will not stage theater in my board," he said. "Then let the audit speak." Silence sealed the room. Even the HVAC seemed to hesitate. Inside, people who measured risk pretended they weren't watching a fuse burn toward their shoes. Maddie clasped her hands. "An audit slows deliverables. We cannot feed our adversaries delay." "Delay isn't our adversary," I said. "Fraud is." Richard's gaze hardened. "I will not have insubordination masquerading as integrity." Final warning. I breathed, counted 4 in, 4 out. "Call it what you like," I said. "The ledger calls it missing." A colonel at mid-table cleared his throat. "If there's smoke, we check the wiring." Richard's jaw worked once. "We are done." But he knew we weren't. The echo would come back. I had timed my words so it had somewhere to land. Dan closed his folder, a quiet amen to a prayer no one admitted was prayed. I gathered my notes slow enough to make the gesture look ordinary. Outside the boardroom, winter breathed against the glass. I could see my reflection layered over the flag like a watermark waiting for heat to reveal it. I had taken the smallest match to the driest timber. Now I needed the patience to listen for the crack. If you hear the echo of truth in this quiet, subscribe to the channel and come with me into what's next, where the audit speaks and the masks begin to crack. I had called for judgment without knowing if it would save or destroy me. They say the loudest silence is when your world collapses. January iced my windows until the city looked etched instead of alive. The radiator ticked. The kettle stalled. My inbox blinked like a stubborn heart. The audit arrived, compliance review, preliminary findings, its neutral mask biting, procedural irregularities, unauthorized access, potential disclosure risk. Judgment, politely phrased, pointed at me. By the time I reached the Pentagon, sidewalks were glass. Security wands chirped. The building kept its rituals while mine failed. People I'd briefed glanced up, then away. The first rumor found me near logistics. I had leaked to a reporter anonymously, of course. The second claimed I'd massaged figures to embarrass a superior. Maddie floated through clusters, shedding sympathy. I hope she clears this up, she told two officers, then passed me with a polished tilt. Rough week, she said, not breaking stride. I carried the printout to the boardroom and waited for a pause that wouldn't come. Richard's voice moved beyond the door, steady as tide. When the meeting seeped into a second hour, I turned and nearly collided with Dan. He took in my face, then the paper. "You've seen it," I said. "Is there a version where the truth survives?" He looked at the seam of the door. "Not in there," he said. The summons arrived without ceremony. Report to security credentials review. At the checkpoint, the guard's tone was professional, almost kind. "Captain Cole, place your badge here." My hand didn't move. "It's temporary," he offered. "While we sort things." The fiction fell between us, a blanket too small to warm either side. Behind me, the corridor gathered faces, curious, blank. Maddie slowed. Dan stood farther back, hands in pockets. He didn't look away. It hurt more that he didn't. I set the badge down. The reader blinked once, then died. A red eye closing. The guard slid my card into an envelope and offered a receipt like a condolence. A second officer took my phone, my laptop, the small items that mean I belong here. With each surrender, the building receded. We moved down the hallway, my steps loud. I could feel the sentence forming around me: security risk. We passed the alcove by the portraits where I used to steady my breath. Now the glass returned a woman who looked like me, but smaller edges thinned by fluorescent light. Richard met us midway, as if by coincidence, flanked by advisors who worked like parentheses. He dismissed them with a flick, and came close enough that his expression became a private address. "Per optics," he said, tasting the word, "we're handling this quietly." "I asked for an audit," I said. "Not a rewrite." He smiled without warmth. "You asked for judgment. This is how it sounds when you don't conduct it." He leaned, and the hallway narrowed to the space between us. "This silence is your coffin." We resumed. The elevator chimed. Inside, rank and rumor stood shoulder to shoulder. On the ground floor, paperwork stacked: temporary suspension, internal review pending outcomes. Phrases piled like sandbags against a flood they invited. Outside, the air cut clean. I walked until knee ache replaced static. A notification buzzed, an unlisted number. "Don't sign anything you didn't read twice." Dan, or someone wearing his caution. I didn't answer. My apartment would be colder than the lobby. I pictured the badge sleeping in that tray, its photo turning pale. Back home, the radiator ticked its rhythm. I set the audit beside my mother's paperweight and pressed my palm to the pages until heat from my skin soaked in. The building had erased me with a smile, and the city moved on. I let the quiet fill the room like water in a mold, hardening into something I could hold. They stripped my badge, but not my fire. They took everything from me except the one thing I hadn't shown them. February pared the trees at Arlington into black ribs against a pale sky. Frost bit the grass and silvered the names. I brought my mother's diary, paper thin as breath, and opened where her steadiness waits. "Justice doesn't shout, it stands." I read it aloud. The wind carried the line back, colder, cleaner. They had taken my badge, my access, my seat. The USB still hung under my collarbone like a buried star. If silence was my blade today, I would hone it. I texted a number I never saved: coffee, no names. The reply was a time and a street. The cafe windows were fogged, the kind that makes secrecy look like warmth. Dan sat alone, civilian jacket eyes, uncertain. He unfolded a napkin, then set it between us like a truce too fragile to touch. "You shouldn't meet me," he said. "You shouldn't have answered," I said. "I was already here." He slid a plain card across the wood. No logo, just numbers that would open a door. "Temporary credentials. They die fast. Don't leave fingerprints." "Why?" I asked. "Because somebody should outlive this." His mouth made half a smile, the other half held regret. He ordered nothing. I held a cup for heat. They framed the audit, I said. Framed? He repeated, keeping his voice small. They also moved approvals off system and washed the trail through a vendor that was born old. Mission velocity, I said, and watched recognition flare. Richard had always sold urgency as virtue. I can't testify to what I didn't see, Dan said, but I can confirm what the system forgot to hide. I left before loyalty turned into conversation. Back at my apartment, I drew the blind, set the diary open, and placed the USB on its spine like a seal. The laptop complained, then yielded. October opened contracts ladders edits the bruise of Maddie's QID. With Dan's code, the lattice widened. Servers I'd mapped by rumor brightened into reachable rooms. Payments hopped like Spark's dormant shell. Expedited logistics, retainers that spelled nothing until initials overlapped. The rhythm 02-1303 470402 repeated like a fingerprint. The pattern became a net. The net closed. I printed 3 pages only and hid the rest where even I couldn't touch them by accident. An encrypted relay pinged. A journalist I once refused to feed wrote, "If you want daylight, I have a room without windows. Bring what cannot be denied. Daylight isn't brightness. It's verification." I copied a line from the diary "Justice doesn't shout" and taped it to the bezel so I couldn't pretend to forget. Night thinned the city. I layered numbers on a whiteboard, arrows, dates, initials until they stopped looking like arithmetic and started looking like decisions. Maddie's mistake no longer floated. It anchored a chain. Her access opened the first door. Richard's signature stood behind the second. The money carried his gait, impatient and camouflaged. Heat moved through me like a fuse catching. This could burn the coal empire. The kettle clicked off. Steam ghosted the room. I packed the 3 pages, Dan's card, the copied quote in my mother's hand, and the USB that had learned the weight of my breathing. I wrote one sentence on a fresh napkin. Stand with it, and slid it into my pocket with the code. Tomorrow there would be a meeting in a room without windows. Someone would ask if I understood the cost of wanting the truth to live. I touched the diary's frayed elastic and the drive's cold edge, and thought of Arlington's rows of names that keep standing. I had lost the room, not the evidence, and not the lesson. Outside, sirens braided with winter wind. Somewhere a bell marked the hour. Slowly now. Next time we sat at the table, it would not be me who stayed silent. They wanted my voice erased, so I brought proof that needed no words. Cold fluorescence flattened the room to paper and steel. Officers lined the table behind nameplates, pens poised, faces drilled for neutrality. I took the far end. The USB rested under my collarbone. In my bag, 3 pages and a card waited. Richard arrived last, carrying gravity the way some men carry flags. He didn't glance at me. Maddie did, brief, taut, smiling like the test had already ended. Dan slipped along the wall, anonymous eyes lowered. The tribunal chair cleared his throat. I began with ledgers, not speeches. I slid copies to the clerk and unfolded a diagram. Payments marked expedited logistics, I said, migrated off-system to vendors with no footprint, then reappeared as retainers. Approvals repeat at off hours 02-13-03 47-0402. This is not urgency. It is evasion. The chair leaned forward. Source internal archives, I said. Captured before files were amended. The footer was forgotten. It points to Logistics Q K4 under Temporary Admin. Maddie sat up. I rotate through queues in surges. That proves tempo, not intent. Tempo needs verification, I answered. Those validations are missing. In their place, edits, columns softened, totals nudged, and a phrase that recurs where it doesn't belong: mission velocity. Heads turned toward Richard. He didn't blink. Buzzwords aren't crimes, he said. No, I said, but they are fingerprints when only one speaker uses them in approvals. The chair lifted a palm. Dates. Dan's voice crossed the table without rising. The surge window aligns with facility logs. Doors registered entries at 0213 and 0347. At 0402, the keypad was used. Scheduling shows the building otherwise dark. Maddie pounced. Speculation. The audit identified the irregularities as hers. I set the audit on the table and slid a transparent overlay across it. Paragraphs lined like a stencil. The language was lifted from boilerplate, I said. The certifying signature belongs to an office that never touched this dataset. Its clerk timestamped at 0402. Richard's voice thinned. You now accuse integrity officers. I accuse a process rushed to create an answer, I said. Names can be brave and wrong at once. Maddie leaned forward. She leaked. Certainty comes cheap when you whisper to reporters. The chair rapped the table. Enough. I did not leak, I said. I learned to move inside the silence you left me. A colonel tapped my diagram. The vendor's born old, I said. Incorporations filed to recycled addresses. One letterhead prints a slogan Richard used in a keynote. Too neat to be coincidence. Richard finally looked at me, the smile he saved for family dinners, the one that writes verdicts. Captain, he said, your fixation reads as disloyalty. You reinterpret speed as theft. Speed that deletes logs isn't speed, I said. It's smoke. Maddie opened a binder and flipped faster when the page she needed refused to exist. This is harassment, she told the chair. Sanction it. Dan coughed and set a single sheet on the edge of the table as if done with it. The date matched my list. The footer held his initials. The chair studied it, then lifted one of my pages. A vein hid and reappeared at his temple. He turned to Richard. Captain Cole asserts these are your approvals. Richard's tone cooled. I authorize tempo. Others execute details. The chair's fist cracked the wood. These signatures are yours, Richard. The room stilled. Someone inhaled too loudly. For a heartbeat, even the fluorescent surrendered. Richard's mouth opened closed. Maddie went very still. Dan lifted his eyes and held mine a fraction permission to keep standing. I stacked the copies and pushed them toward the clerk. Enter them all, I said. Pull the door logs through the night. The chair nodded. We will recess for verification. Chairs scraped back, but no one quite stood. The room feared choosing a side. Richard did not speak. He pressed his knuckles white against the table, then let them go. Structures fail along the line you pretend isn't there. I could see that line now. In that silence, I saw the first fracture spread across his empire. Some masks fall with a whisper, others shatter with a roar. The Pentagon auditorium glittered like a well-kept live flag's cameras along the balcony, a podium polished to reflection. I sat where the floodlights could not conscript me. Richard took the stage chin-set notes untouched. He opened with the vocabulary that carried him: efficiency, readiness, mission, velocity, lacquer over flawed wood. He denied without saying no, recast irregularities as misread tempo. When a camera's red light winked, he answered with the dining room smile that always preceded the sentence. Questions rose sharp, then padded by politeness. Were authorizations processed off-system? We maintained operational flexibility, he said, within policy. Door logs at odd hours. Surge windows demand presence, he replied. He built a bridge of generalities and bet fatigue would carry the press across. I could have read the hours, 02, 13, 03, 47, 04, 02, but the tribunal held my pages. Proof didn't need my breath. I watched the thread he could not feel begin to fray. Maddie stepped into the light uninvited. She didn't take a question, she seized one. Let's be honest, she said. This smear comes from someone who couldn't keep up. I oversaw surge protocols. I rotated cues all night because that's leadership. A reporter's pen paused. Which cues? Lieutenant K4, she said quickly, then too late, K14. We worked off hours, 0300, 0400. Richard's eyes cut sideways. He hadn't granted her the stage, she'd borrowed it. He slid forward. We won't discuss configurations. The press smelled blood. Lieutenant, another voice called. You're confirming temp admin on QK4 between 0300 and 0400 because FOIA logs show entries at 02, 1303, 470402. Are those yours? Her smile hiccuped, then returned. Leadership shows up when showing up with whose credentials, the reporter said. Tribunal records flag missing validations. If you were rotating, why were the checks blank? She looked for the old signal, the small nod that turned weather favorable. None came. Richard's jaw set. The mask strained. Tempo compresses paperwork, she said. We cured gaps within policy. Ask the board. A second journalist stood. The certifying office named in the audit never touched those datasets. Also your public Instagram. The projector filled with her reflection in a midnight window. Timestamp 0349. You were on that floor while the log registers an entry. Earlier you denied accessing those cues. A ripple moved breath paper and angled dying. Maddie's face went soldier still. Richard sought a lower register. We will not let rumor compromise operations. General, a veteran correspondent, said rumor isn't our exhibit. Your phrase appears in approvals mission velocity and on vendor letters predating contracts. How, without coordination from your office, he froze a beat too long. Thus, cameras drank the pause. Under white light, speed became panic. Maddie tried one last pivot. We moved quickly to save lives. Paperwork doesn't define integrity. Paperwork defines money, the first reporter said. Money defines motive. The tribunal will verify signatures. For now, your statements confirm access at the hours in question. Do you want to revise? Her confidence unwound like tape from an empty spool? No, she said. Richard gripped the podium as if wood could hold the tide. We will not adjudicate on camera. But cameras adjudicate by existing. No shouting professionalism held, but the shutter's click became percussion, a quiet roar that makes facts audible. In the back, Dan stood without moving gaze level. I stayed seated. The tribunal would read. The public had watched a mask come off. A final question rose soft, but carrying General Cole. If the signatures match and cues align, do you accept responsibility? He did not answer. In the instant where an answer should live, the structure he'd built took on the tremor of a bridge under weight. Maddie stared at the floor. A red light blinked. Somewhere, a producer mouthed cut, and nobody obeyed. The crowd turned, and for the first time their silence was not mine to bear. They once built palaces on silence, now the same silence buried them. May heat clung to the courthouse steps. Microphones hissed, marble seemed to sweat. Reporters formed a half-moon, lenses lifted like shields. I stood at the edge of the crowd, not center stage, not hidden, just where sound carried clean. Inside, verdicts clicked into place like rounds, chambered fraud, falsified records, abuse of authority. Outside, the air learned their shape. Richard emerged first, not in uniform, the absence louder than sirens. A marshal's hand hovered near his elbow. The gesture said, escort, not ally. The medals he loved had already been boxed there, quiet, finally honest. He searched the steps for altitude and found only ground. A question struck him. General, do you accept responsibility? And for once, he had no theater left. The answer failed to arrive. Maddie followed. Crisp edges turned ragged ribbons stripped from her jacket. The friends who used to flank her studied their phones with the zeal of converts. She saw me, and the smirk she wore as armor never materialized. Isolation has a weight. You feel it when the crowd stops pretending it can carry you. Flashbulbs started their white storm. Each pop carved the morning into frames, Richard's mouth half open as if searching for a script, his shoulders accepting ordinary gravity. The image everyone would print was the smallness, how a man built on command shrinks when command stops echoing him. Dan reached my side without ceremony. No triumph, only tired relief. It held, he said under the noise. It had to, I answered. He nodded toward the door. Bond terms filed. Travel restricted. Referrals will stick. His voice was the same from quiet hallways, spare, precise kind because it refused performance. At the foot of the steps, questions sliced around Maddie. Did you access QK4, validate the vendors who moved approvals off system? She tried the old rhythm tempo urgency, but the words rang on empty air. Do you regret anything someone asked? She looked to Richard for gravity and found a void. I regret mistaking speed for proof, she said, and the line worked like a confession. A wind lifted the flag above the entrance. It cracked like a gavel. I remembered his whisper in the corridor. This silence is your coffin, and felt the sentence swing on its hinge. They built on silence, counted on it to make inconvenient people disappear. Today, the same silence refused to catch their fall. It simply watched. Marshals led Richard through the corridor of cameras. A young soldier lowered his phone and whispered not unkindly, "Sir looks small." I thought of family dinners of a chandelier that made everything shine except the truth. Palaces, I realized, are just rooms that mistake echoes for loyalty. A woman from procurement brushed my sleeve. "Thank you," she said quickly. "For daylight." She vanished before I could answer. Not every ally arrives early. Some appear when the cost of absence becomes unbearable. Dan handed me a thin envelope, the tribunal's order, and a single line he'd written, "Stand with it." I folded the paper against the diary in my bag. Evelyn said, "Justice walks, not sprints." Today, it took the stairs. Cameras kept working. Headlines would grow teeth. I tuned the noise out. The evidence would be cataloged, the charges wired into systems that don't care who your father is. Slow processes, yes. Slow, like tide. Richard looked back once and met nothing he could command. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. I let the silence between us do the speaking it had been owed since the first time I learned to swallow it. As his empire fell, mine was only beginning. They thought revenge would be loud. They were wrong. June laid a calm hand over Arlington lawns, combed into quiet ripples, rows of marble bright as bone. I brought a folder, the tribunal's report light as paper, heavy as consequence, and Evelyn's diary, its elastic tired, its corners softened by years of rescue. I knelt and set the folder against her name, the way you place bread beside a candle. No speech, just the truth, standing upright at last. They said silence was a coffin, I whispered. It was a vault. Wind lifted, approving us. I read her lines like a shoreline memorized in childhood. Justice doesn't shout, it stands. Today it stood without my hand on its back. I left one page, the summary, others will frame, and tucked the rest away. It didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to the stone and the nameless who do work that refuses applause. On the walk out, a procurement clerk fell into step. Eyes on the path, she said. We were afraid. We're less afraid now. She squeezed my arm and veered toward another row, as if gratitude shouldn't learn to crowd. My new office sits in a building with windows that refuse to tint the world heroic. The door bears my name. Inside the walls are spare, a whiteboard, a timeline no longer redacted, 2 chairs that face each other instead of the desk. I kept the old paperweight on the sill. I kept the silence too, but now I use it like light. Dan arrived without knocking because he knows how much space a knock takes. He looked around, weighing the corners. You've changed the rules, he said. Only the ones that punished listening, I answered. He set a small plant on the sill, the kind that survives on neglect and stubbornness. For continuity, he said, then quieter. There will be days they try to make the old rules true again. We'll make them repeat themselves, I said. Repetition shows cracks. Emails arrived. A captain I barely knew wrote thank you for daylight. A contractor sent a scanned receipt he'd been told to destroy. The subject line read simply, keeping. None of it looked cinematic. That was the point. Legacy isn't a fanfare, it's a ledger that balances at last. In the afternoon, I returned to Arlington with a pen that doesn't leak and hands that no longer tremble. I smoothed a blank card against the stone and copied the final line from the diary in my own careful script. We show up. It looked smaller when I wrote it. It felt larger once it was there. I spoke to her the way we used to in rooms where the radio murmured and the house kept secrets I learned to translate. I thought revenge would sound like applause, I said. It sounds like doors opening without being kicked. Clouds shouldered the sun and the light softened into something human. I took the long way back to the office past the cafeteria where a junior analyst lifted 2 fingers in a shy salute, past the corridor where portraits once judged me and now observed instead. The first day after an empire falls feels like a hospital hallway disinfected, hushed full of work you cannot rush. At my desk, I opened the diary to the last page and left it there not as a monument, but as a manual. Visitors come sit and leave lighter. We talk about process and duty and what to do when speed demands a lie. We practice quiet until it becomes a habit we keep, even when the room gets loud. As the city folded into evening, I turned off the overheads and let the window do the rest. The paperweight cooled. The plant held its line of green. Somewhere in the building, a printer sighed. Somewhere on the hill, a flag caught a breath and settled. We show up. I finally understood justice is not shouted, it is carried. They once erased me with silence. Now silence became the proof I had won. July 4th, 2024. The Pentagon press room wore its patriotism like full-dress flags, bright a navy backdrop of stars, cameras stacked like a second crowd. The podium light waited. I stood beside it, hands steady, a medal cool in my palm. Dan took a place along the wall near enough to steady me if the air tilted. Reporters leaned forward, credentials, clinking questions like arrows. Captain Whitlow, a statement. What does justice feel like? Their voices braided as if the date required fireworks from my throat. I remembered the chandelier and the portraits the verdict delivered before the meal. I remembered learning to hold my words until they could carry weight. Evelyn wrote it when I was too young to understand justice doesn't shout, it stands. It had stood in tribunal rooms and on courthouse steps. It would stand here. I didn't approach the microphones. I lifted the medal earned across years that left more paper than photographs and let the ribbon rest against my knuckles so that metal and pulse aligned. The cameras adjusted. The room inhaled. A reporter tried again, softer. Captain. One word. I thought of Dan's stubborn plant of clerks who slipped receipts into envelopes marked "Keeping of Junior Officers Discovering Daylight Without Trumpets." I thought of Richard disappearing into a corridor where his voice no longer opened doors. I thought of Maddie's last glance at the floor. One word would have been too small. I let the silence settle, heavy as a verdict, gentle as a hand. I turned the medal, caught the light, and raised it to shoulder height, where the lenses could read its history. Dan's chin dipped the smallest salute. In the back row, phones flashed into life. A headline took shape before the press secretary could clear his throat. Captain Whitlow speaks without a word. Another outlet typed the subhead as if it had been waiting all year. A room learns how to listen. I heard the whir of the cameras settle into a hush, the kind that follows a held breath when the truth finally lands. Applause tried to start and thought better of it. The room learned a new etiquette, listening without trying to own the sound. I stepped aside so the flag behind me claimed its part of the frame. Independence Day is an inventory of debts, of vows, of who holds the line. Today it counted a freedom that doesn't wave, it endures. Afterward, a young analyst approached, eyes bright, voice small. "Ma'am, I'm starting where you started," she said. "Where should I put my voice?" "Where it won't be wasted," I said. "Where the records live, I'll help." She smiled like a recruit who had found a map. Dan met me at the door. "You just made quiet the loudest signal in the building," he said. "We show up," I answered. The diary's last line kept step with us down the corridor. Back in my office, I set the medal beside Evelyn's paperweight in the square of sun. On the board, a training schedule, weighted verification daylight, the ethics of speed. If there is a sequel, it will be written by other hands. My job is to keep the ink from running. I walked back for one last look at the press room. The lights had cooled. The flag stood easy. I touched the doorway the way you touch a threshold remade by your feet. My story didn't end in silence, it began with it. If my fight moved, you stand with me now. Share this story, speak my name, and demand daylight wherever power hides. Tell me in the comments where you saw courage or where I faltered. Your witness sharpens my next step. I learned that silence isn't surrender. It's a tool when paired with evidence, patience, and allies. Keep records, trust patterns, question hurry, and never trade truth for applause. If someone erases you, rebuild your name with receipts and calm. Show up even when unseen. And when the room grows loud, let your quiet carry weight until the facts speak for you.